So, how does this affect the political discourse here in the United States? Joining me now to discuss this is Dr. Natalie Stroud, who teaches communications at the University of Texas in Austin. She's also the author of the book Niche News, The Politics of News Choice, which explores the consequences of exposure to partisan media. Welcome to the show, Dr. Stroud. So what are the consequences? Let's start there.
There are lots of consequences to the use of partisan media. In the media environment right now, we see that a lot of people are using media that match what they happen to believe. And some of the consequences of that include, first, developing more polarized political opinions, and second, becoming more engaged in politics and more energized to participate. So those are two of the primary consequences that I explore in my book.
Well, energized, I guess most people would say that's a good thing, getting people involved in the political process. But the other thing that I kind of, and I want you to talk about this if you can, I spoke to a still photographer earlier this week who's been out on the campaign trail all year long. And he almost laughs when he flips on MSNBC and Fox because he says some minuscule thing, one side will seize on that, somebody else will seize on something else. And he says it gives such a weird kind of view of things. He kind of says to himself, were they at the same political event I was at?
It's true. When you flip between the channels after any political event, you get a completely different picture of what you just witnessed. And these cable networks are interested in finding those moments that might attract a certain like-minded audience, so they're viewing things through this partisan lens.
Natalie, what about this concept that basically you flip on the news just so you can look in the mirror, in a sense? I mean, you want somebody who's going to basically mirror your beliefs, and what are the real dangers of that for a democracy?
I think one interesting component of flipping on the news and looking at whatever matches what you believe is that people don't always recognize that they're doing this. So when they're looking for information, they look rationally and say, which source gives me the best quality, best information I could find? And it just so happens that when we make those sorts of judgments, they tend to be related to what we believe. So the things that match what we believe are those things that we trust. And I think that's really consequential for democracy because it suggests that we might have some trouble figuring out what sort of media out there would offer us information that crosses a partisan divide.
Well, let's talk about the fairness doctrine. We touched on this a little bit in our setup piece. How critical has that been in creating this landscape out there?
There's been research to suggest that after the fairness doctrine wasn't being enforced as strictly, that it did open the airwaves for some conservative radio programs. And definitely we see the commercial success of these sorts of partisan programs, and I think that that's a real factor that contributed to us seeing more and more of this partisan programming in the media environment.
So do we need it back?
Challenging to say that we need it back. So it's very hard to figure out whether or not a media program has actually covered both sides and who's going to make those sorts of decisions. That's really tricky territory. And we're also not in a media environment in which a few news outlets, in which we have to divide the spectrum among a few news outlets. Rather, today we're in a situation where everyone can have a voice as long as you have internet access and a few basic technical skills to use the internet. So it's a really different environment that doesn't match the situation in which the fairness doctrine was established. And we also have a lot of concerns. I think we should have a lot of concerns about how we would actually enforce a fairness doctrine today.
Well, I want to get on to some of these specific networks in a minute, but let's touch on what the broadcasters' complaint was about it when they wanted it erased, which was instead of like tackling controversial issues, they just shied away from them. So I guess that's the flip side of this, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Many folks have gone on record saying that they believe the fairness doctrine had a chilling effect. So they said, if I have a choice between covering a controversial issue and potentially running afoul of the fairness doctrine or not covering a controversial issue at all, they opted for the latter.
Let me talk a little bit about the Fox network. They have this great slogan, we're fair and balanced. And yet a lot of people would say, well, that's not necessarily true. And I have one example, the Shirley Sherrod story, which I'm sure you're familiar with. She worked for the USDA, the Department of Agriculture here in the United States. She was making this address. She's an African-American woman talking about how she was really kind of talking about her own kind of racist sensibilities, how she didn't like white people, but then she evolved. But there was a clip used on Fox, which was the first part, the setup, not the context. And within literally no time at all, she was forced to resign. And finally, of course, later the true story gets out. What about this sort of thing where they just zone in on something and get it out there, and then if I'm watching at night and I don't pick up the newspaper 2 or 3 days later, that's my belief system.
It definitely is a behavior that we see for these partisan media outlets, particularly channels like Fox News or MSNBC. They're in the business of covering 24 hours of news. And so for them, they really are looking for those moments that they could grab a hold of and turn into something that really gets their audience energized and gets them involved and gets them returning to that outlet for additional news. And so I think we see when we have moments that can be taken out of context even and used for partisan ends, we see these networks capitalizing on those moments.
But you also have these websites that are also leaning either to the left or the right. They're very popular. What's the answer?
The answer to the partisan media environment, I think that a lot of the answer lies in the hands of consumers. So if we can encourage consumers to look across the partisan spectrum and do so with an open mind and start to really think about which site gives me the best issue content, and can I look at a side from the left and from the right and really figure out what's going on out there, I think that can really help to get people focused on criteria other than partisanship and more focused on things like issue coverage.
Well, there's a famous saying here in the United States, what came first, the chicken or the egg? But we look at Washington, D.C., and we see this partisan environment, and yet you see people watching the news and getting their news from these analysts who are very, very partisan. They want something to get done in Washington, and yet they're probably driving this thing. Who's more responsible for the problems here in Washington? Is it the politicians who want to be partisan so that they can go on these shows and kind of stoke the fires, or is it the people watching the news who say, oh, these guys are so bad? Which side, who's responsible?
I would agree with the way you characterized it. It's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem where it's really hard to point the blame in one, either in the government realm or in the public's realm, but both are feeding this process. So as government officials go onto programs that match their partisan leaning and then say inflammatory things that then energizes the public to then go out and advocate for partisan causes, it just turns into this spiral of people who are looking at partisan media. Government officials are then going to those partisan media. That in turn polarizes the people who are watching those outlets and adds fuel to the fire for government officials who are going onto those programs.
We talked about the fairness doctrine, but there's something else at work here, which is back in the good old days, the networks kind of looked at news as a loss leader. They didn't care if it made money. Now it's seen more as a business. Guys like Bill O'Reilly demanding huge audiences, huge paychecks. How much of that is a problem?
Depends on who we're talking about, whether or not it's a problem. So for Fox News, it's definitely not a problem. He's certainly a revenue generator, and that's a good thing from their perspective. And he's cheap. Cable news programming with partisan personalities like that is very cheap. So in that sense, maybe it's not such a bad thing from a business angle, but from a democratic angle, I think we should be nervous when we have audiences that are continually looking at like-minded information, becoming more polarized, and becoming less tolerant of views unlike their own.
Dr. Natalie Stroud, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us from Austin, Texas. Certainly appreciate it.
My pleasure.